Today's readings give us a chance to think about the relationship between we and them, whoever the we happens to be in a given situation, whoever the them happens to be in this given situation, and how our response to that might make us think about our relationship with God, especially how we can encounter the presence of God through encountering people who are different than us, who are other than us. And and one of the original kind of catastrophes of Christianity is the fact that at its roots we became a community of Jewish Christians and later Gentile Christians who no longer recognized our other Jewish siblings as being part of us, and vice versa in many cases. That early break between Jewish Christianity and non Christian Judaism. That has continued through the centuries with catastrophic effects, especially in relationships between Jews and Christians in Europe. And one of the hangovers of that, we have many hangovers from that, but some of them are part of our theologies or our ways of thinking about the world that we don't even always recognize. And one of them is about how do we think about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? So there's a stereotype, a harmful idea that we sometimes still hear. It might even be part of the way we go through the world of thinking, well, Judaism was closed in on itself. It was all about internal stuff. It didn't really care about anything else or anybody else. And then Jesus came along and his new thing was universalizing this and opening this up for everybody. Now, there's a deeply anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic problem there at the heart, is that it doesn't take seriously all of the ways in which Judaism was an outward-looking religious tradition. And today's first reading from the book of the prophet Zechariah is a great example of that outward-facing tradition, where it talks about how in those days when God restores the world, that people from all over the world are going to go to Jerusalem to worship in the temple there, this house of prayer for all peoples. And I love this image that in those days 10 people of every nationality shall take hold of every Jew by the edge of their garment and say, "Let us go with you. We have heard that God is with you." So there's a sense of this being still a way that centers Judaism and centers the relationship of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Miriam, centers that relationship to God, but doesn't keep it as the special hidden treasure only of the Jewish people, but is a way of saying this is a gift for the rest of the world through us. It overflows into ways in which Gentiles, those of us who are not Jewish, get to be, through Christianity for many of us, in relationship with the God of Abraham and Sarah. That we, to use St. Paul's image from Romans, that we get grafted on as sort of extra branches to the firm tree of Jewish faith and reverence for the name of God. That we can now we see our true identity as the younger siblings of our older siblings in faith. So getting past that idea that somehow Christianity is the only time that Jewish tradition started thinking about others is an important part of our continued reconciliation with our Jewish siblings, who are just like us now in some ways, trying to figure out how do we together reverence the name of the Holy One, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Our second reading from Mark gives us some more information about how do we relate to them, whoever we are, whoever they are. And as Jesus is going to Jerusalem, he's going to face his death, and he's going to stop in a village for the night, but it's a Samaritan village. And the Samaritans say, you can't stay here. You're not going to our temple at Mount Gerizim. You're going to your temple in Jerusalem, so you can't stay here. And then James and John, who like the disciples in Mark often just don't get it. James and John say, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" And Jesus turns and rebukes them, and they go on to another village. So we have three possible ways here of how do we relate to them, whoever they are who are different than us, not part of our we. One is the Samaritans' answer here. They missed a chance. They missed a chance to encounter God through Jesus because they weren't open to the conversation. They weren't open to the dialogue. And in some ways, that's, I think, the most common thing that we have is feeling safe in our own villages and not being open to seeing where God might be walking by and could be welcomed more into our life. How do we see God in people who are other than us? And I don't just mean the people who are like, we're proud that we're welcoming because but the people that we most disagree with politically, the people we most disagree with in our church together. How do we learn to see where God might be active in them? The second reaction is the reaction that James and John have is, well, if they don't like us, well, to hell with them. Literally in this case, sort of, send on fire and brimstone and destroy them, because their otherness, it seems like a threat to ours. It seems like they're dissing us. It seems like they're disrespecting us. And I think that's also part of the way we form a we, is by talking about and talking bad about the people who are not us. So there's a way in which that response of building up our own identity by losing or eliminating others' identity, again, think back to the Jewish Christian relationship, at least in the European context, that's another temptation to take our identity at the expense of other people rather than letting them be, which is this third response that Jesus has of sort of letting them be, giving them the autonomy to say no to the conversation, moving on. That we can offer what we can and we don't have to try to do more than that. But Jesus is also keeps trying to have that conversation. Where does this work for our own lives? Well, right now this week, the first of 2-year meetings, a meeting this year and next year on the Synod on Synodality are happening in Rome, which are a chance for us as Catholics together at home through our prayer and our participation, and there in Rome for the assembly, are meeting other Catholics who feel very other in many cases to us, who feel very different. It's a chance for them to see where might God be speaking in voices and contexts and experiences that aren't my voice, my context, my experiences, my safety. How do we bring that back home? Well, how do we do that in our own parish? How do we do that in our families, in our institutions, in our schools? How do we make that space of letting be and opening into dialogue while also not cutting people off if they're not ready for that conversation? That's a question you need to think through. At the heart of it, though, is something that ties both stories together, is this conviction that God can be found sometimes by grabbing onto the clothing of people where you see God present and asking how through you, even if you're very different than me, even if you're not part of us, my group, how do I go with you and say, we've heard that God is with you, show me, tell me more? That might be our challenge this week, is to ask, where do we find God in these unexpected people? Where does that help to break apart the boundaries, the walls that divide us into an us and a them?